This is the Devil's Guide to D&D. Devil's Delegate here, and this week we're looking at the effects of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything on the rest of D&D. Last week, while discussing WotC's radical shift in the design of the Sorcerer and their tendency not to fix old problems or update previously released subclasses, I said it would be easy for individual DMs to add 10 spells to each of the older Sorcery Subclasses. Well, I guess I have to put my money where my mouth was. If you missed that video, the link is there, or wherever YouTube will let me put it, in the description if no place else. Now, the idea here is that WotC has finally come around to the notion of giving origin spells to the Sorcerer, 10 of them, 11 if a cantrip is added, to fix some of the problems with the class. For many people, this creates an imbalance. The new classes are simply better than the old ones. For me, the larger issue is that the new subclasses, mainly Aberrant Mind, give an identity to the Sorcerer that it's been lacking. Not just with the spells, but with the ability to cast them with sorcery points and without components. So to fix my issues and those of other people, 10 spells and the ability to cast them with sorcery points need to be added to each of the older subclasses. But as WotC isn't going to do that, it's up to individual DMs and, well, the devil. So take this as the devil's lists. I'm going to go through each of the subclasses and give you 10 spells. And yeah, it wasn't quite as easy as I thought, and it was time-consuming. I'll start with the easiest and work my way to the trickiest subclass. And that easiest subclass to work with is Storm Sorcery. Now, I could say that that's because the theme is the clearest. On the other hand, I could just say that this is the easiest because WotC already did it for us. Yeah, you see, Storm Sorcery, when it was originally published in the Unearthed Arcana, had spells. They were removed later when it was republished. So we've got a list. So if you want, just take these and you're done. Now I wouldn't. This list is before Xanathar's, and there are several spells in Xanathar's that are really fitting for a Storm Sorcerer. Plus, even if WotC was doing this list now, they wouldn't make it like this. If they put this into Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, I can promise you the Conjure Elemental spells would be missing. Also, this list has 9 spells instead of 10, and just for consistency, I like 10. So, okay, what would I do? Well, for first, third, and fifth level, I'd keep it pretty much the same. Fog Cloud, Thunder Wave, Gust of Wind, Levitate, Call Lightning, Sleet Storm. The few others I was looking at, Featherfall, Warding Wind, Thunderstep, and Windwall, all of which would be reasonable choices, but I've no reason to take any of those over these 6, so I'm going to leave those in. I would say I would add a cantrip, and that would be Gust. Gust is certainly not going to overpower anyone, but it does give some proper flavor for a Storm Sorcerer. I do change things a little bit once we get to 7th level with the 4th level spells. I'm going to keep Ice Storm. It is, after all, a storm, even if it is cooler. It's not a particularly great spell, but the Storm Sorcerer might find some use for it. But to join it, I'm choosing Storm Sphere. Storm Sphere is the most fitting spell in the game for a Storm Sorcerer. It's from Xanathar, so it didn't exist before. But it lets you knock around your opponents with wind and then shoot them with lightning bolts. Then we get to 9th level. I'm going to pull in another Xanathar spell, which is Control Winds. Again, not one of the strongest spells in the game, but if a Storm Sorcerer isn't going to have Control Winds, who is? If you want to be the God of Thunder, bringing the damage, crashing down with thunder all around you and flashes of light, then Destructive Wave is your spell. Now, it's not going to be as good for a sorcerer as it is for a paladin or a cleric, since they like to wade into the middle of battle and sorcerers do not, but that's okay. After all, this list is not to give the spellcaster the very best spells to use all the time. Instead, what we're giving here is a spell that is really fitting, that's very flavorful, and a bit situational. The second easiest is the Draconic Bloodline, and it's already a bit complicated. Why is it complicated? Because when somebody chooses it, they choose between 10 dragon ancestors and 5 different elemental damage types. So, from one philosophy, when you come up with a list of spells to give, you ought to be giving spells that are specific for those 10 dragons, or at least for the 5 different elemental types. And that's just overkill. Dragon sorcerers are already incentivized to take the elemental spells that match their dragon ancestor. They do more damage with them, so they're already going to be taking those. Well, then the thought might be, well, you can get more of those from other lists and fill in for some of the poor types of dragons who don't have that many spells. Except it doesn't work out that way. The sorcerer actually has most of the elemental damage spells. The only one who gains much of anything are the fire dragons, and sorcerers have enough fire spells already. If the elemental spells aren't the ones to put on the list, then what are? Well, how about just 10 spells that are good for all dragon types and that go off the other aspects of a dragon ancestor? Well, what aspects? Well, the overwhelming power of the dragon, their dominating presence, their fearful presence, their ability to control what's around them. And also probably look at their ability to change into other forms. Okay, so let's see what we can do. Well, at first level, I'm choosing Cause Fear. Dragons are frightening. Now, it's not a great spell, but it is a non-sorcerer spell, so you are gaining something that you wouldn't normally have, and there are situations where it could come in useful. You probably wouldn't take it if it wasn't given to you for free, but we're giving it to them for free. And especially if you're casting this with sorcery points, where people won't know you're doing it, it's going to work particularly well. People are just going to be frightened of you because of your power. My other choice at first level would be Chromatic Orb. This is a reasonably decent low-level damage spell, and it can do whatever type of elemental damage you want it to do, so it can fill in for any of the dragon types. Second level, we take Alter Self. Dragons can change form, so why can't a dragon sorcerer? And along with it, Dragon's Breath. How much more iconic can you get than Dragon's Breath? And again, it does different elemental damage types, so it can fit in with your dragon ancestor. When we get to the third level spells, which we're getting at 5th level, the first one is very obvious, and that is Fear. This is really one of the key choices of this list. My other choice is Elemental Weapon. It's a non-sorcery spell, so that's nice. It's not a particularly fantastic one, but if they find their way into combat, into melee, and have to use a sword, well, it's nice if that sword is now magical and doing your ancestral dragon type of damage. You get 4th level spells, which I choose Elemental Bane, another one that's not normally on the list, but is helpful to do some extra damage if you focus on elemental damage. And polymorph, because again, dragons changing form. And 9th level, for our 5th level spells, start with dominate person. Who's more dominating than a dragon? And my second choice is legend lore. This is a non-sorcerer spell again, and this is about the stories and knowledge of the world. And if anyone knows the ancient stories, it's a dragon. This is a very workable list. There's some nice spells on it. There's some very situational spells. They all fit the tone of the Dragon Sorcerer. Next comes Wild Magic. And that comes in next because it's easy, because there really aren't many choices. In fact, there are not enough choices. There are not 10 spells that are fitting for the Wild Magic Sorcerer. WotC really needed to write some spells here. It wouldn't have been so hard to write a few chaotic spells. Since they haven't, you do it. Write some spells for your own game. Put in 2, 3 more chaotic spells, just to attack ones that do random effects. But since I didn't want to add in a bunch of my own homebrew for this, I'm going to work with what we've got. Well, what do we have? Well, I wanted to choose spells that were as wild and random as exist. And when I run out of those, then go the other way and choose spells that are so fundamental to a magic user that even for a wild mage, they'd be pretty predictable. Now, one thing that does exist are spells that have different choices. So there was an idea suggested by others on the internet that instead you give the Wild Magic Sorcerer a bunch of these spells, but with an add-on that they don't get to choose what the spell does, but it's rolled randomly. For this, we're talking about Chromatic Orb, Dragon's Breath, Enhance Ability, Pyrotechnics, Bestow Curse, Elemental Weapon, Contagion. And the problem with this is that a lot of these spells become very weak if you can't choose what they're actually going to do. Is the sorcerer really ever going to cast Enhance Ability if he can't decide what ability he's going to enhance? If these spells did something more interesting, more fun, if it did give it more of a wild magic flair, I might have gone for that. But they really don't. So, what do we have? Well, at first level, Chaos Bolt. That's kind of the given spell. If there's any spell that's going to fit the Wild Magic Sorcerer, it's Chaos Bolt. Along with that, since there were no other wild spells, I went with Detect Magic. At third level, I brought in Enlarge Reduce, because popping up and down in size seems to be very fitting, and Misty Step. That was with the idea that teleportation has a certain random feel to it. I mean, you're appearing and disappearing around the battlefield here and there, and that fits particularly with Misty Step, unlike Dimension Door, where you're opening a door and it's more calm and reasoned. Misty Step, you're just here, and then you're over there. At fifth level, we did get the other spell that I felt was fitting for the Wild Magic Sorcerer, and that's Blink. It's a good defensive spell, and it's random. You're on the battlefield some turns, you're not others. It just happens. And then with that, Dispel Magic as, again, a very basic, fundamental kind of spell. Seventh level, Confusion. Confusion does have a bit more of that whole psychic feel, but hey, we can reskin spells for different uses. And are you really affecting your enemy's minds, or are you just affecting the universe? Either way, you have to roll a die to determine what that opponent is going to do next turn, so that feels pretty wild. And as far as freedom of movement, hey, if you're a wild sorcerer, you just can't be held down to any place. Ninth level, I came up with Contact Other Plane and Reincarnate. Reincarnate is really the straightforward, nice choice for the wild magic sorcerer. After all, if they're going to save someone, of course they do it in a random way, which brings you back as a whole nother species. By the way, this spell was written when there were a lot fewer player classes, so you might want to adjust it when you have to roll for it so that the dead character could come back as any race. As for Contact Other Plane, well, without a lot of other good choices to go for, Contact Other Plane felt fitting because who else but a wild magic sorcerer would be dumb enough to want to talk to entities in other universes and also suffer the somewhat random chance of their mind being blown away from it. Should mention Contact Other Plane and Reincarnate are both spells not normally on the sorcerer's list. So, is this a good list? It's as good as you're going to get without writing some new spells. And that's 3 of the 5 sorcery classes that need to have spells added to them. And I think this video's gone long enough. So I'm going to make this a multi-parter, and we'll come back next time to do Shadow Sorcerer and Divine Soul, because both of those are a bit more complicated. So that's it for now. Please like and subscribe. Keep playing D&D. And remember, late at night when you grab that thick, luscious chocolate cake, there's no reason why you can't just eat the whole thing.